Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi Chullin, 1 week at a time. Today is our fifth class, and today we are going to be reviewing Daf 27 through 33. And we are going to continue discussing shechita. Again, the ritual slaughter. So on Daf 27, the Mishnah tells us, and of course, last week we finished the first chapter. So today we're going to begin the second chapter. Now, we're going to learn some fundamentals. If one did shechita, again, slaughtering of a bird, you only need to shecht one siman. Again, siman literally means sign, but here, as we explained previously, right, we have two pipes, or everyone, right, animals and humans, have two pipes in their neck. One is the esophagus, which is the digestive tract, and one is the trachea, which is for breathing. So those are called the simanim. Okay, again, so we'll use the word simanim from now on. Simanim basically means the two pipes. So for a bird, you only need to sever one of them. For an animal, you need to sever both of them. Now, the Mishnah says that a majority of this, if you cut a majority of the siman, that is enough, meaning you don't have to completely sever them, but a majority of each one is enough. Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to sever the blood vessels, which again, Aliza was asking from the beginning. Now, we will, again, there are two blood vessels in the neck, right, the jugular and the carotid. So here, Rabbi Yehuda says you have to sever the blood vessels in the bird for it to be valid. Now, again, the other opinion, the first opinion, it talks about the different pipes and is not concerned about the blood. Now, we'll see later on that obviously we have to get rid of the blood from the animal, and the best way to do that is to sever the blood, the arteries, but it's not, again, according to the first opinion, it is not what makes the shechita, the slaughtering, halachically valid. So that's just the distinction. Again, so it's the simanim in the first opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says it's the blood vessels. Let's say you only did half of the siman for the bird and 1.5 of an animal, that would be invalid. And we said, again, you need a majority. And in a minute, we're going to discuss half. Is half, right? We know that, at least in the English language, half is not a majority. It's half. So that's what we're going to discuss in a minute. So here the Gemara says that really, for the bird, the best way to do shechita is to sever both the simanim. But if you only did one, so then it is still valid. Okay, let's take a step back. Shechita, again, slaughtering, needs to be done on the neck. We learn it from a verse that says that it's from the police, right? It says like shechita, so shach, right? Shechitayu or sachitayu, meaning where the head bends down. That's where you're going to slaughter the animal. Now, the head can only bend down because of the neck. The Gemara says, well, what about the tail? The tail also bends down. So we say, no, the tail is always down. I mean, it can move around, but it's generally down as opposed to the neck, right? Sometimes it's straight, sometimes it's bent. Another explanation is it's where the dam hanefesh, where the blood, the lifeblood leaves the body. And therefore, that's the place where the slaughtering should be done. Now, we said in the very beginning, like 5 weeks ago, when we started Chullin, we spoke about 5 things that invalidate the shechita. So there were 5 things that invalidate the shechita. These things are learned from Moshe. There's a concept, we've seen it before, but in Hebrew it's called halacha leMoshe miSinai. It's a law that was given to Moshe on Sinai. What does that mean? It means that it's not necessarily written down in the Torah, but it was transmitted orally to Moshe. So here the Gemara tells us that the laws of shechita were given to Moshe on Sinai, right? There's no verse in the Torah, this is exactly how it needs to be done. Rather, it was transmitted orally. The verse also teaches that you don't cut the animal in half or like in 2 pieces. Another explanation that we know it's the neck is, again, as we said, you cut where the blood flows. Again, the Gemara says, well, the blood can flow from the nose, right? But that's not a normal place where blood flows. So therefore, it has to be the neck. Another explanation is it's shachat, but you can also read it as sachat, which means sach, like the place where the animal makes noise, again, which is the throat, which is really the neck. Okay, then the Gemara tells us that the bird needs to be slaughtered just like the animal. Again, but it is, right, you learn one from the other, but the law is different, meaning, as we said, 2 simanim for the animal and 1 siman for the bird. And we know that in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, there was a difference. The animal was done from the front of the neck, but the bird was done from the back of the neck in the Beit HaMikdash. But for shechita, the bird also needs to be done from the front. The Gemara compares different animals. So we have, I keep saying the word animal, but when I use it in relation to bird, it means sheep, cow, goat, right? What we would call either a domesticated animal. Those again need 2 simanim. A bird needs 1 siman, and a fish doesn't have any simanim, right? You just take it out of the water, that's it. Some in like Chassidut, in like more mystical circles, they say fish is on the highest level because there's no shechita at all, which is an interesting idea, right? You just gather the fish. Okay, the Gemara describes the Roman general Kuntrikon, who asked a lot of questions of Rabban Gamliel about creation, and he says, it's interesting, birds were created from a mixture of water and land, or really they were just from the water and brought to man, and then to name him, man, Adam named all the animals on the land. Now, the Gemara teaches that there's no biblical obligation to slaughter a bird from the Torah. It's only rabbinic. It's only dirabanan. And you have to cut the simanim, again, somehow. And the wild animal, the undomesticated animal, like a deer, that does need shechita. Now, again, we know a bird really does need shechita, but again, it's done differently. A bird, So we'll learn it later on in this masachet, but birds and wild animals, when you shech them, their blood needs to be covered. When it spills on the floor, that's called kisui hadam. Their blood needs to be covered. However, if you do shechita in the wrong way, you do not need to cover the blood. The Gemara says, no, maybe that's just about the chayah, the undomesticated, the wild animal, and not the bird. Then on daf 28, the Gemara tells us that if you stab a bird, again, you don't do kisui hadam. Or maybe you do need, even if you did it this way. If you did melika, again, remember, from the back of the head of the bird, but with a knife. So then the animal becomes a nevela. And we'll talk more about this today. Again, to remind us, nevela means an animal that just died, not from shechita, and a nevela gives, it becomes impure and it transmits impurity, as opposed to a treifah. Treifah is an animal that is mortally wounded. We'll discuss it in a later time, what that means. But a treifah does not give impurity, does not give tum'ah. Okay. Next, we said that you only need one siman to be severed for a bird. One opinion is it could be either one, again, trachea or esophagus, or you have to sever the esophagus because it's the most important of the simanim. If you sever the esophagus, and then the trachea was actually pulled out, which is generally not okay, but in this case, it would be valid because it's a bird. You only need to sever one of the simanim, which you did. And now what you do afterwards doesn't really matter. But if you pulled out one of the simanim and then shechted, that would not be a valid shechita. If you shecht again, for a bird, each siman, but only half of each one, it's invalid. But let's say you shecht half of the trachea, then you wait, and then you finish it. So then that would be valid. Okay. Now we'll discuss more about this in a minute. If half of the trachea had a blemish on it, and then the person cut the rest of it, right? So half is like cut because of a blemish, and then you cut the rest of it, that would be valid. And then the Gemara asks, are we talking about the bird? Or maybe not. Maybe we're talking about an animal. And the person cut the rest of the simanim, meaning 1.5 of the simanim. Okay. Let's say the Gemara gives a case where there was a duck and it had blood on its neck, and then they said, well, if it has blood on its neck, should we slaughter it and then check if there was something wrong with it inside, or check it and then slaughter it? So the Gemara says, yeah. So first what you should do is, again, you can't tell what's going on the inside. So you should check the trachea, then cut the trachea, then check the esophagus. So that proves, again, here's a bird. It proves that you can cut either one of the simanim for the shechita to be valid. Okay, now the Gemara gets to Aliza's point about the blood. So the Gemara says because most of the time they used to roast the bird whole, right? Birds are small and you can roast, like your rotisserie chicken. Because you roast it whole, you have to cut the blood vessels in the neck so that you can empty out all the blood and then you can roast it whole. But for an animal, that's not the case. An animal you're going to cut up into pieces, and therefore, because you're going to cut it up anyway, you don't have to specifically cut the blood vessels for shechita. Okay, but Rabbi Yehuda says you actually do need to cut the blood vessels for shechita, and not just to empty the blood from the animal, but in order to create a proper shechita. Then the Gemara says no. The only reason you would have to cut the blood vessels is because you want to drain the blood. Therefore, you can even just poke a hole in the blood vessels to drain the blood. You don't have to sever them. Okay. Then, now the Gemara discusses the concept of half and half versus majority. So the question is, if you cut half of one of the simanim, is it seen as a majority and therefore valid or not? Okay. On one hand, you can say you're not allowed to let a majority to remain intact. And therefore, if you cut half, so there isn't a majority uncut, therefore it would be valid. Or the idea is you have to cut a majority. And therefore, if you cut half, you did not cut majority. So the Gemara says that Rabbanit, meaning rabbinically, you need a majority, but deoraita, meaning biblically, a half, if you only cut half, it would be valid, right? So that's the distinction. Okay. Hold on one second. So now the Gemara gives different cases where we have this idea of half and half versus majority. So let's say you have an oven. Okay, in the old days, the ovens were made out of like a clay. Now, let's say it became impure. The only way to purify it is to break it and rebuild it. So let's say you break it into two, right? Which is what we would call half and half. So then the Gemara says it's still impure. That shows that maybe half and half is not enough, right? So here it says, well, because you can't tell which one is bigger. Therefore, if you could tell which one was bigger, then it would work. But again, two halves eaten, right? Again, if you could make it into exactly two halves, each piece, neither piece is a majority of the oven. That's the issue. But when you cut, if you cut at least a half, so then that again, maybe that would be valid. Okay, Doc 29. Again, half of the trachea, if it was cut, and let's say half of the trachea was cut, and then the person cuts it a little more, that would be valid. So it shows that a majority have to be cut, but you don't necessarily have to do the cutting for the whole thing. Okay, to make something a treifah, again, being mortally wounded, it has to be visibly a majority, but for shechita, maybe not, and then maybe half would be okay. Or no, everyone agrees that when you're doing shechita, half is not valid, but the machloket is actually about a Pesach that became impure. Now, this is when we're talking about, which was actually for Israel last week's Parsha, for everyone else this coming week's Parsha, the concept of what's called Pesach Sheni, right? What happens in the desert? The Jewish people are told they have to do Pesach, the Korban Pesach, and then people come to Moshe and they say, wait a minute, we are impure. We are tameh met. We're impure, and therefore we cannot do Pesach. We want to be able to do it another time. And from there is the birth of second chances. And God says that a month later, they can bring the Korban Pesach. Now, we learned in Masechet Psachim that if the majority of the Jewish people are impure, then actually on regular Pesach, they can bring the Korban Pesach, even though they are impure, right? It's called Pesach Bitum'ah, where they are allowed to bring the sacrifice, even though they are impure. And here the discussion is, when it says a majority of the nation, what if it's half and half? Is half and half considered majority? So that is the machloket that is discussed here. Okay. Okay. If you shecht two animals at the same time, meaning you line them up and you just go across, that would be valid. But if we're talking about a sacrifice, that would not be valid. And the Gemara talks about this idea of partial sacrifice, meaning partial shechita. The Gemara brings up the case of Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol would start slaughtering the animal and then collect the blood, and then another Kohen would come and finish the shechita. So the Gemara says, you see here, it could be split up. The Gemara says, no, maybe the Kohen Gadol actually did the majority and which was enough of the shechita, and then the other person just comes and finishes it off at the end. What about if a non-Jew cuts one siman and a Jew cuts the other siman? That would be invalid, again, because of the order. Let's say you shecht, all right, one is siman outside of the Beit HaMikdash and one inside. So again, do we say, and this is going to be a big machloket in this masechet, do we say shechita is from the beginning till the end of the process, the whole thing is called shechita? Or do we say you only look at what happens in the end, right? Meaning it's only at the end that the animal dies, so maybe that's what counts and not the beginning and the end. And that would be a distinction, meaning if someone, right, the non-Jew starts it and the Jew finishes it, or if you do a little bit outside and a little bit inside. So then, again, the question is how you see the shechita. We have the same thing with the para aduma, the red heifer. The question is, again, do we see the process from the beginning till the end, or only at the end? Okay, daf 30. We have hold on a second. Okay. So now the Gemara is going to talk about the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach, if you if you slaughter it without the proper intention on the 14th, so then it would be invalid. But any other time, if again you didn't think that it was a Pesach, so any other time than Pesach, that would be valid. And here the Gemara is discussing what intention you need. Do you need intention when you're doing shechita, that it is for this specific sacrifice? And again, what if you, when you start it, you didn't have the proper intention, but when you finish it, you did? And then the Gemara says that this is specifically for Korban Pesach. What happens if you shecht? Now we'll go back to a regular animal. What happens if you shecht in 2 or 3 places? So in the neck, the Gemara says that would be valid. But wait a minute, the Gemara says you have to open up the area. Therefore, 2 or 3 places isn't doing that. It looks like small holes, so therefore it would not be valid. But again, the Gemara says, what if it's one cut, but it's like an arrow, meaning like, on a diagonal? What about if you have 2 people holding the knife, even if it's on an angle, and then they slaughter the animal, that would be valid. Again, 1 knife and 2 people, but 2 knives would not be valid. Okay. Now, we spoke about different things that make the shechita invalid. One of them is called chalada. Chalada means to borrow the knife, meaning sorry for doing it on my neck, but instead of doing it, from here, you stick the knife in, right, in between the 2 simanim. That is not okay, meaning you have to come from the front of the neck and cut both simanim. You can't come in from the side and only cut one of the simanim. So that would be invalid, right? And then, like, if you go from inside and then cut forward or cut backwards, all of that is invalid. Okay, the next Mishnah says that if you shecht 2 animals at one time, it would be valid. Again, regular animals. If 2 people, again, this is what we quoted before, if 2 people hold the knife, even at an angle, that would be valid. If you severed the entire head or you shecht in one movement, that is invalid because that's called pressing down, drisa, which we'll talk about in a minute. If the knife is 2 times the length or the width, I guess, of the neck, then you could cut both simanim in one try, meaning you don't have to go back and forth. And therefore, if you've ever seen a shechita knife, the larger the animal, the longer the knife. And this way, because it's so long, you can just right, all the way across and cut both simanim, and you don't have to go back and forth. The back and forth is when the knife is small and you want to make sure that you get both simanim. Maybe you need 3 times the length of the neck in order, and if it would be valid. If you go back and forth, again, even if it's a short knife, that is valid. Now the Gemara explains that the verse teaches that you need a smooth motion, again, generally back and forth. And the knife, daf 31, the knife has to be the length of the neck. Maybe that means plus, right? Meaning 2 times the width, I guess, or whatever you want to call this direction of the neck, or maybe it needs to be right. It needs to be 2 times, not 1 plus a little bit. The knife cannot have a hook on the end of it, right? Again, that will tear, and we don't want tearing. And a needle tears, so therefore that is not okay. Next Mishnah on 31. Let's say you're in the middle of doing shechita and the knife falls, and then I take it back. You have an animal, and the knife falls and shechts the animal on the way down as it's falling off the table, right? You have an animal sitting next to you, and the knife just falls off the table and shechts the animal. That is invalid shechita. You need intent and the action of a person. Now, again, if a person threw the knife, that would be valid because intention, and it's coming because of the force of a person. And the Gemara actually says, right, if you threw it, it would be valid. If you threw the knife at the wall and it shechted the animal on its way, that would be valid. Another opinion is it would not be valid. The Gemara then gives a case of a woman who's a nida, and she accidentally went to the mikvah. We'll discuss what that means in a minute. So the Gemara says that if she accidentally went to the mikvah, she could have relations with her husband, but she cannot eat truma, meaning she is seen as tehora, as pure on the intimacy part of her, but not in the sanctified food part. She is not pure enough to eat from truma, and we'll see why in 1 second. Or maybe there's no such thing as accidentally going to the mikvah, and it doesn't work at all. So the Gemara learns from here that we have a lot of worlds, but here in this discussion, we have 2 worlds. One is the mundane world, what we call Chullin, right? That's our Masechet. Chullin means mundane, regular. And then we have the world of Padshim, of Kedusha, of holiness, things that have to do with the sanctity of the temple. So the Gemara says that when we're talking about the realm of Chullin, you do not need intention. So if she falls into the mikvah, she would be permitted to her husband, because that's in the world of Chullin. But to be able to eat truma, which is something that's more sanctified, you need intent to go to the mikvah. And again, the Gemara brings a few other cases of intentional and unintentional, right? We'll learn later on this idea of a wave that falls on a person, right? Is that intentional or unintentional? So the Gemara explains that for the nida, what's the case? That maybe her friend pushed her into the mikvah. If that's the case, it's for sure valid because the friend had intent for her to go to the mikvah. Therefore, she would even be able to eat truma. So the Gemara says, no, she just fell. Like she fell off the bridge into the ocean, and the ocean is like a mikvah. And therefore, again, she'd be permitted to her husband, but not for truma. Okay. We said if you shecht 2 animals at the same time, it would be valid. If you shecht an animal with the para aduma, with the red heifer, that would not be valid. If it happened by accident, so then the para aduma, the red heifer, would be invalid, but the other animal would be valid. Daf 32 explains, sorry, 1 second. Okay. Daf 32 explains that for the para aduma, the verse says it needs to be slaughtered by itself. It cannot be done with another animal. Therefore, it would be invalid if you did it with another animal, but maybe not with another sacrifice. Maybe it depends what the animal is, or even if it was a regular animal, a Chullin animal. But if you cut a squash at the same time as you shechted the para aduma, so then if you did it on purpose, it is invalid. If you did it by accident, it would be valid. Okay, next Mishnah. We're now going to talk about shehiyah. Okay, shehiyah is another thing that invalidates shechita. Shehiyah means a pause or a delay, right? So now, if you started shechting and then the knife fell and then you picked it up, or you sharpened the knife in the middle of the slaughtering action, if the pause is long enough to do shechita, then it's invalid, meaning you waited too long. Or maybe the length of time is long enough to examine it, and we'll see who and what. Then it would be invalid. So the Gemara says it's long enough to slaughter another animal. And then the question is, if I'm doing a sheep, does it mean long enough to shecht another sheep? Or could it even mean to slaughter a bird, which is much faster? So the Gemara says, it's the same animal. Whatever animal you're slaughtering, you're not allowed to wait the amount of time that it would take to slaughter another animal of that thing. Maybe it means long enough to bring another animal. The Gemara says no. It has to be that it's as if the animal is right there, and then it's the amount of time it takes to lift it up, put it down, and slaughter it. That's the amount of time. However, says the Gemara, if you're using a very dull knife and you're cutting all day, that is not shehiyah, meaning as long as you don't pause in the middle, you can be cutting all day, that would still be valid. What if you did a majority of the simanim and then you paused? So the Gemara says, Teku, we're not sure about that. What does it mean, the time to examine? So maybe it means to get an expert, a chacham, to come and to check the knife. The Gemara says, no, maybe it just means the amount of time. Sorry, 1 second. The amount of time for the actual butcher or the person who's the shochet to shecht to examine the knife. Okay, if you wait, hold on 1 second. Why does it say Mishnah? Okay, if you cut the esophagus and pull out the trachea, or vice versa, or you cut one siman, waited for the animal to die, or you cut one siman and then stuck the knife into the side and then you cut it, all of these things would make the animal a nevela. Okay, so now this Mishnah is not talking about would the shechita be valid. The shechita would not be valid. But we're now concerned, okay, you can't eat the animal, but now we're concerned, is the animal a nevela and therefore tameh, meaning impure, Or no, the animal would be a treifah and would not be, it would not be impure. Okay, so and therefore the Gemara explains, the Mishnah, if the problem was with the shechita, so then the animal becomes a nevela. If the shechita was totally valid, but it got messed up for a different reason, then it would be a treifah. And in the end, Rabbi Akiva, who argued a minute beforehand, actually agreed to this explanation. So now, the Gemara says that in the next perek, it's called Elu Treifot. It's a list of what makes a treifah. Again, treifah is a blemish, something wrong with the animal that's going to make it die within the next 12 months. But again, as we said, a treifah is not going to impart impurity, but a nevela will. So in the next perek, when it talks about the treifah, it actually has our case where you shechted the trachea and then you pulled out the rest of the other siman, and it says that it's a nevela. But if you did the opposite, it would be a treifah. So the question is basically, are two mishnayot contradict each other? So the question is, why do they contradict each other? So there are a number of opinions. One is, it depends where you did the shechita. If, let's say, the blemish is where you actually do the shechita, so then it would become a nevela. If not, then it's a treifah. Again, right? So again, does it impart impurity or not? The Gemara gives another case. If you cut the trachea, again, which is the pipe that's connected to the lungs. So if you cut the trachea and then afterwards the lung becomes punctured, right? Something punctures the lung, and then you cut the esophagus, that would be valid. Now the Gemara says maybe only because the trachea is connected to the lungs and you already did that siman, but if you cut the trachea, but then the stomach gets punctured, which are two different systems, then the animal would be a treifah and not a nevela. Okay. Next, daf 33. Here, the Gemara is now going to discuss the concept of, in Hebrew, what's called ever min hachai, which literally means the limb of a live animal. Jews and non-Jews are not allowed to eat meat off of a living animal, right? The idea is we don't want people walking around and grabbing a leg off of a sheep and just like eating it. So the Gemara gives a case where so the Gemara starts with the internal organs. A Jew can eat the internal organs of an animal because we do shechita, but a non-Jew cannot eat the internal organs because they just kill the animal. And then when they pull out those internal organs, it could be that the animal is still alive, and therefore they're actually eating, right, ever min hachai, a limb from a living animal. Therefore, this would be forbidden for a non-Jew. The Gemara says this is not the halacha, and that would not be the case. But the Gemara does say that if apparently eating, I don't want to say meat from a live animal, but eating meat like right after it was slaughtered is apparently something that's very healthy to do. So the Gemara says that if the person takes meat from the place where you actually did shechita and you remove it right away, even though the animal might still be alive when you do that, you would be able to eat it, because again, you have to salt it and make sure it doesn't have any blood in it, but because you did the shechita, it would be okay. And the Gemara adds that non-Jews can do the same thing as well. Okay, next Mishnah. If you shecht an animal, or a bird, and no blood comes out, I don't know how you did that, but okay, it is still a valid shechita. So, right, that's against what we said before with Rabbi Yehuda. And you could eat this animal with impure hands, because, okay, so let's take a step back for 1 minute. Two things. One, we know that food, in general, only becomes susceptible to impurity, to tum'ah, if it becomes wet from one of the 7 liquids. One of those liquids is blood. So the meat, if there was no blood, I don't know how there's no blood, but let's pretend there's no blood when you did shechita, so then nothing, right? It didn't become wet with the blood. Therefore, it is not susceptible to tumah. And therefore, one other point, the sages said that our hands, because we do lots of things with our hands are what's called a sheni lituma, which means they have what we would call secondary impurity, right? Or impurity of the 2nd degree. Okay. Now, how do we get rid of that? Right. That's why we wash netilat yadayim. Netilat yadayim, washing our hands, gets rid of this impurity. Again, up to a certain point. So, okay, so so now the Gemara explains, because the blood didn't come out, you don't have to wash your hands to eat this meat. But if blood did come out, which in general it would, the Gemara says, why would you have to wash your hands? So the Gemara says, again, hands are a sheni, like secondary, tum'ah, but hold on, our animal is Chullin. Remember, it's mundane, and it doesn't matter if you're a sheni, because that doesn't affect regular Chullin meat, right? If we were talking about a sacrifice or truma, so then we would care, and then it would be very important. So we say, so we have different explanations of what the Mishnah is talking about. One opinion is we're speaking about Chullin, but it was bought with money from Maaser Sheni. Remember, Maaser Sheni is what's brought to Jerusalem, and you have to buy food there and eat it in Jerusalem. It has a certain level of sanctity. Therefore, it could become impure with your hand, and that's why we have this this issue. Or maybe the Gemara is talking about touching it versus eating it. Maybe there's a difference. Or it's speaking about hands that are actually a rishon, right? Primary or 1st degree tum'ah, not a sheni. Right? How would this happen? Let's say you put your hand into a house that has tzarat, again, last week, or for you, this week's parsha, where Miriam gets tzarat. So we know that tzarat can also go in a house. And if you put your hand into the house, maybe the hand becomes a rishon, primary, or 1st degree, and then that would be an issue. Another opinion is that a sheni, right? Again, the hands can make chullin, a shlishi, again, a third degree, but not, there's a distinction between if the impurity is biblical, on a biblical level, or a rabbinic level. And the last answer is no, we're actually talking about a very specific case where it's chullin, meaning a mundane animal that was treated like hekdesh, like kachim, like a sacrificial animal or sacrificial meat. This is an important concept, and we'll talk more about it next time, where people, specifically, let's say Kohanim, who want to be very careful about the meat that they eat, will treat even regular meat as if it is a sacrifice so that they don't get confused, or so that they don't by accident, change or get mixed up between different types of meat. And chullin that's treated like kodesh actually could become a shlishi, a third degree impurity, and that's the case that we're actually talking about. But really, we'll talk more about that next week. Okay. With that, we have a few minutes, but next week, regular time, hopefully, Bezrat Hashem. Okay, yes.
All right. The reason I sound like a broken record is the whole point of all of the intricacies of the chullin is that this animal doesn't suffer. And I'm sure you said Rabbi Akiva, and that the Rambam stuck in my head, did mention the carotid artery, because as soon as it's cut, that animal loses consciousness. But you pull out a trachea, for heaven's sakes, that's inhumane. That animal is suffering.
Hear what you are saying, and we do not want animals to suffer, but it is important to recognize that it doesn't say in the Torah, right? You shech the animal this way so the animal doesn't suffer. It's not it's a value for us, but it is important to recognize that that's not something that's explicit in the Torah. And therefore, we're going to, we want it to be as humane as possible, but we have to recognize that there are certain laws that need to be done. And it could be that the reason we say you have to shech both simanim is exactly what you're saying, because if you get through both simanim, you have severed probably the blood vessels, and that is the best way to make sure that the animal is dead and not, kind of convulsing around. But I do feel it's important for me to say that, although that is an important value of ours, but it's not the
reason.
It's not the reason. Thank you. It's not the reason that we do certain things. So we have to be careful with our language, because if it's only about not suffering, so then, right, why don't we tase the animal or do certain things and then shecht it? But again, we have to be careful because, there are certain laws that need to be followed. So
basically, I don't totally understand it.
You don't have to understand it. That's the whole point. That's the whole thing. It's what it says, and that's it. That's without understanding.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to get at, Zohar. Yeah.
Yes. Helen, I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, I wondered whether any of these decisions about whether an animal is allowed to be eaten or not are based in some measure on the poverty of the community, so that you don't waste an animal. And is that, would that guide some decisions for the community?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think because of that, we have so many details. If you remember, we talked about the shochet, the slaughterer or the butcher, needs to be an expert before he can do it, because again, we don't want the shechita to get messed up, because like you said, if you invalidate it, you now just lost all of that money. I think the same thing about the concept of, again, I'm interpreting. It doesn't say this is because, but my interpretation is, right, again, we talked about you have to check the knife. Why is it so important to check the knife? Because we want to make sure that every shechita is valid, I think, because of exactly your point, meaning meat is expensive, and we want to make sure that every shechita, or as many as possible, are as valid as as possible. So I do think it is taking that into consideration. Yeah. Ilanit, yes.
Yes. Well, just to go off to some other topic on our dafim, on daf 31. Yes, 31 on the backside. It discusses the tevel in waves. So I've got my pots and pans or whatever utensils, and I want to tevel them. And for some reason, I'm standing in a place where I'm counting the waves because I'm going to catch the wave at just the right way to do it. And if I toss it in the air, it's invalid. But Rashi says, if I set it down, and the wave comes over it and smashes down onto it, that's valid. So all of this was really kind of confusing. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. My question would be, and I know Tosafot answered Rashi, and I didn't read that. I always assume it must be a refutation or something. But anyway, we're supposed to be sure that all surfaces are covered in the water. So if I set it on the ground and it crashes onto it, I'm thinking a part of that utensil did not get teveled. What do you think?
It floats. It floats.
The assumption of the wave case, which we'll get to, I don't know if we've done it. I mean, it's in.
It was on 31.
It's in, it's a great case because it talks about intentionality, and right. Normally we talk about putting things into a mikvah, but it creates a case where the mikvah actually comes to you. But the assumption in that case with utensils and the wave, the assumption is that when the wave, right, when so much water falls, on a cup, on a pot, the assumption is it floats in the water and the whole surface is going to be covered. So that is the assumption, because it has to be 40 se'ah amount of water that falls on this pot. So there really isn't a way to construct a case where 40 se'ah fall on something and only hit like one side. Like the assumption is everything is going to get toveld. But it is a unique case. Yes. I would say it's much easier to dip it into the water than to wait for the wave.
Thank you.
Yes.
I've got a second one after.
Wait, I just wanted to answer just a little minute of what you had said. The difference between placing it and having the wave come or throwing it in the air is what you the human is doing. And as the Rabbanit said, is the intention. The human is, if you just threw it in the air, that means you're not toiveling it. You're just throwing it in the air. So if you put it in such a way that it's in the way of the wave, and then the wave comes, you have done the beginning. The human has done the beginning of toiveling it, and that's why. And of course, then it floats, etc. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful, both of you. Well, you spoke of intentionality, and then of course there was the woman who falls off the bridge. And of course, I mean, I kind of get all where that was interesting, all these conditions. But of course, we have to assume they all meant that she was someone who had finished her nida or whatever, because she's not pure if she was still in Nida and accidentally fell off the bridge, right?
Correct. The assumption is, she was planning on going, later that night, but on her way, she fell into the, yeah, exactly.
It sounds like,
Yeah.
Do we have any time left? You've been there a long time. Can we ask another question?
Yeah, go ahead. One more.
Okay, I'll be quick. The non-Jew can go into the Beit HaMikdash and have a sacrifice, but if there's they're trying to make something kosher, a non-Jew will mess up the actual process. I don't understand that. He can go in and do a sacrifice, but he can't help with the process. I don't get it.
A non-Jew can bring a sacrifice, but the service is going to be done by the Kohen. The service is not done by the non-Jew, right? Also, the regular Jew, meaning in the temple, it's the Kohen who's doing the service. Here, we're talking about outside of the Beit HaMikdash, outside of the temple, where you're just shechting an animal. We said that because you need intention, so the non-Jew doesn't have intention. The Jew needs to have intention. So shechita needs to be done by the Jew.
Jew, got it.
Yeah.
One more to just make it really exciting. The limb of a living animal, okay? It's wrong for any human. There is something, I ask every few years and I still don't get an answer, but I just thought I'd let you know, maybe you have an idea. There is a practice by non-Jews who have cattle when they are going ahead and castrating them, that they will take those testes. Now the animal is off and he's living and he's fine, and they will take those and they will fry them up and they will eat them. And they call that Rocky Mountain oysters.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's, clearly a functioning limb of a living animal. What do you think?
Yeah.
They're hungry, that's all.
Sounds problematic to me. That would be a very tight, literally a limb from an animal. Yeah.
A living animal.
I'm not, judging. I'm just saying it sounds like a limb from an animal.
And that's Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach is one of the...
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Thank you.
on that note,
Thank you.
wishing everyone a great week, a Shabbat Shalom, and Be'ezrat Hashem, we will meet next week. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you.